He stood silently as the smug judge mocked him and slammed down a massive fine. Everyone in the courtroom laughed, thinking he was just an old man. But no one knew he once trained the very judges who now passed sentence. What happened next left the entire courtroom stunned. But let's start from the beginning. The courtroom was unusually full for a minor municipal case. A few reporters sat in the back, bored interns flipped through their notepads, and a couple of law students whispered about traffic citations. It was supposed to be just another routine hearing on a slow Wednesday morning. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, and an elderly man entered slowly, his polished shoes echoing softly on the stone floor. Walter Harris, 73 years old, with silver hair neatly combed back and a modest navy blue suit, walked with the quiet dignity of someone who had long ago stopped caring what others thought of him. He held no briefcase, no lawyer beside him, no papers in hand. Just a calm, steady gaze and a thin folder tucked under his arm. Judge Brandon Cole, notorious among the locals for his arrogance and tough-on-everything attitude, barely glanced up from his screen. He was in his early 40s, clean-cut, confident, and condescending. A man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice and saw the courtroom not as a place of justice, but as a stage. "Case number 3842, his voice rang out. "Walter Harris, parking violation in a restricted government zone. Defendant present?" "I am, Your Honor," Walter said politely, his voice calm but steady. Judge Cole raised an eyebrow. "Ah, Mr. Harris," he said, flipping through the digital file. "Illegally parked in a clearly marked area. Anything you'd like to say before I sentence you?" Walter took a slow breath. "Yes, Your Honor. The signage was recently changed. I parked where the previous sign indicated public access. I've taken photographs to—" Cole held up a hand. "Spare me the lecture," he interrupted with a smirk. "I've heard every excuse in the book, and most of them are more creative than this." The audience gave a faint chuckle. Walter stood still, unbothered. The judge leaned back, lacing his fingers across his chest. "You know, Mr. Harris, it's always the older ones. Retired, too much time, and apparently too little respect for the law. You folks think the world owes you something because you've lived long enough to complain about it." A wave of unease spread through the courtroom. Even the court stenographer paused for a split second. The bailiff cleared his throat quietly. Walter didn't flinch. "With respect, Your Honor," he replied, his tone still composed. "I believe deeply in the law. I only ask to be treated with the same fairness you would extend to any citizen." "Fairness?" Cole repeated mockingly. "You expect fairness when you violated a clearly marked restriction? That's rich." He lifted his gavel, striking it down without hesitation. "You are fined $500, case closed. Next." The bang echoed like a gunshot through the courtroom. Walter blinked, then slowly nodded. He turned and walked out without a word, his head held high, but his eyes, sharp, thoughtful, held a weight of something deeper. Not sadness, not shock, disappointment. The room was quiet as the next case began. A few whispered, "That was harsh," but no one spoke up. No one questioned it. The old man was gone, and so was the moment. But that moment would return with a vengeance. Outside the courthouse, Walter stepped into the early autumn air. Leaves blew gently across the steps, catching in the creases of his coat. He paused for a second, placing a hand on the railing, gazing at the flag above the building, waving with an irony not lost on him. He didn't call anyone, didn't complain. He walked 3 blocks to the nearest bus stop, sat on the bench, and waited. As the bus pulled up, he offered the driver a polite nod and took a seat in the back, staring out the window, deep in thought. He thought not about the fine, but about what that courtroom had become. Once, it had been a place of reverence for him, a temple of reason, argument, logic, and principle. Now, it felt like a schoolyard run by bullies with gavels. And the worst part? He had seen this kind of judge before. He had taught them. Back in the courthouse, a young clerk named Jenna, no older than 22, sat behind the reception desk eating her lunch and scrolling through the court's schedule. Something about the interaction bothered her. That old man, his calmness, the way he spoke, the way he stood, it wasn't ordinary. She typed his name into the system, expecting nothing. But the first search result made her freeze mid-chew. Walter E. Harris, former professor of law, Columbia University, author of The Ethical Bench, advisor to the Judicial Reform Panel. Jenna blinked. Wait, what? She clicked through, scrolling past articles, citations, seminar videos. There were images of Walter shaking hands with Supreme Court justices, videos of him giving lectures to federal judges, a quote in a Harvard Law Review article, a photo from 1996 of him being awarded for lifetime contribution to judicial ethics. And just this morning, he'd been mocked in open court by a man who had likely skimmed his textbook in law school. "Guys," she said, her voice trembling with excitement, "you need to see this." 2 interns rushed over. One of them muttered, "No way. That was him?" Jenna nodded. "That wasn't just some retiree. That was the Walter Harris." What started as a whisper among the interns turned into a wildfire across legal forums and courthouse emails. Within hours, screenshots of Walter's books appeared on Reddit threads and Twitter posts. TikToks began popping up. "Judge bullies old man, and you won't believe who he is." By that evening, even major media outlets were picking up the story. One headline read, "Judge ridicules legal legend in courtroom blunder. Internet outrage erupts." At first, Judge Cole remained unaware of the brewing storm. But that ignorance wouldn't last long. Because when you humiliate a man like Walter Harris, you're not just disrespecting a defendant. You're mocking the foundation of justice itself. And justice, as Cole was about to learn, has a long memory. It started with a whisper. The courthouse halls, usually buzzing with routine chatter about upcoming cases and lunch orders, took on a strange electric tension that Thursday morning. Jenna, the young court clerk who had uncovered the identity of the man Judge Cole mocked, sat at her desk, stunned, staring at the monitor. "Are you sure?" her coworker Brad asked, peering over her shoulder. Jenna didn't answer immediately. She simply scrolled through the search results. University honors, keynote speeches at national bar associations, awards with embossed seals, photos with Supreme Court justices. And there it was, Judge Cole, years younger, standing in the back row of a judicial ethics seminar. At the front of the group stood Walter Harris. "Positive," Jenna whispered. "That old man yesterday? He taught Cole's class. He literally wrote one of the texts in the judicial training curriculum." Brad let out a low whistle. He mocked a guy who mentored his own mentors. Publicly. It was too late to keep it quiet. The screenshot Jenna had taken of the Columbia University page with Walter Harris's profile had already been texted to a friend in the media. That friend posted it in a private legal group on Facebook. Someone in the group tweeted it with a short caption. "Judge insults retired man in traffic court. Man turns out to be retired law professor who trained judges. You can't make this up." Within hours, the tweet had thousands of likes, retweets, and angry comments. Hashtags like #JusticeForWalter and #JudgeCole began trending. Legal TikTok picked it up next. Clips of Walter's old interviews were edited over dramatic music with titles like, "This man just wanted to speak. Instead, he was humiliated. Until the world found out who he really was." Meanwhile, Judge Cole was completely unaware. He was running through the day's docket, sipping coffee and giving his bailiff a smug smile. "Let's keep it moving today. I've got a golf tee time at 3. But when he stepped into the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The usual small crowd had doubled. A couple of local journalists sat in the back row. Jenna avoided eye contact, and even the bailiff seemed stiffer than usual. "Next case," Cole said, a little louder than usual. Jenna leaned toward the court recorder and whispered, "He has no idea what's happening, does he?" "Nope," the woman muttered, "but he will soon." Backstage, if you could call the court's administrative offices that, the staff could hardly focus. Phones buzzed non-stop with alerts, emails poured in, and a district supervisor had already forwarded a formal inquiry from the state's Judicial Oversight Committee. At lunch, the courthouse break room was filled with debate. Half the staff were furious, the other half quietly thrilled. "I mean, he needed to be humbled," said Thomas, a junior clerk. "He's been throwing his weight around for years." "But to insult that man?" Jenna replied. "It's like mocking Einstein for using a calculator." Nobody disagreed. Across town, Walter sat at a small cafe by the park, sipping his coffee and feeding breadcrumbs to a pair of pigeons. He hadn't turned on the news. He didn't own a smartphone. He had no idea his name was everywhere. He had spent the morning walking, thinking, remembering. Not about the insult itself. That barely scratched his skin. What haunted him was the state of things. How a courtroom could feel more like a personal stage than a place of balance. How young judges, eager to assert control, often mistook arrogance for confidence. And how little reverence remained for the law's core values. It wasn't always like this. Walter remembered his early days teaching. He'd stood before rooms full of students, young, hungry, eager. He remembered Cole specifically, a cocky, impatient student. Smart, no doubt. But always cutting corners. Always quick with a joke, slow with reflection. Walter had warned him once. A judge who can't listen will one day fail to speak with justice. Now, years later, he had seen the result. Back at the courthouse, the story hit national news. CNN. Retired law icon, publicly mocked by local judge. The Washington Post. Courtroom disgrace, legal giant, disrespected in municipal case. YouTube thumbnails, judge humiliates. Elderly man, but wait till you hear who he is. Public opinion turned into a tidal wave. Law professors across the country voiced outrage. Legal organizations issued statements of support for Walter. Columbia Law School's Twitter account posted, "Walter Harris shaped generations of legal minds. His legacy speaks louder than any gavel ever could." By afternoon, even late-night talk show writers were preparing jokes. Cole's courtroom wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It had become a stage for reckoning. That evening, a formal email was delivered to Judge Cole's office. He was being requested for an immediate ethics review. His assistant tried to sugarcoat it, but the damage was clear. "Sir, it's bad. There are now calls for censure, and someone found an old video of you attending Harris's ethics seminar in '09. It's circulating." Cole leaned back in his chair, the color draining from his face. He stared at the wall, where his law degree hung proudly, signed by the same dean who once praised Walter Harris in a commencement address. The weight of it all settled like fog. For the first time in a long time, Judge Cole had nothing to say. And yet, amid the noise, Walter remained quiet. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't make statements. He simply prepared for the guest lecture he had been invited to give weeks ago. Ironically, at the very same courthouse. A lecture on judicial decorum and the role of humility in law. When the organizers confirmed, they asked politely, "Given the circumstances, are you sure you still want to speak?" Walter smiled gently. "Now, more than ever." What no one knew, Not the court staff, not the press, not even Cole himself, was that the final act hadn't even begun. Because Walter wasn't interested in revenge. He believed in something more powerful, a public reminder of what justice was supposed to look like, and what happens when we forget. It was the most ironic coincidence imaginable. Weeks before the incident, the county courthouse had scheduled a special guest lecture in their Judicial Continuing Education series, part of a quarterly program aimed at fostering ethics and professionalism among younger judges and clerks. The guest? Professor Walter Harris. The theme of the lecture? Judicial decorum and the role of humility in law. At the time, it had been planned by the courthouse's administrative director and approved by the state bar. But now, the lecture's mere existence felt like divine intervention. Word had already spread that Walter had accepted the invitation, despite what had happened in Judge Cole's courtroom just days before. And yes, he would be giving the lecture in that very same courtroom. By Friday morning, the atmosphere in the courthouse was unrecognizable. Security had been quietly reinforced. Journalists from 3 national outlets were confirmed to attend. Local TV vans parked outside before the sun rose, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had, unintentionally, sparked a national debate about justice, age, and ego. Judge Cole sat in his office, the blinds drawn, staring blankly at the invitation reminder flashing on his computer screen. Guest speaker, Professor Walter E. Harris. He hadn't spoken to anyone all morning. His usual arrogance was nowhere to be found. Even his assistant noticed something different. A nervous tapping of his fingers, a silent stiffness in his shoulders, a long pause before every breath. He had thought about canceling the event. But canceling now would only make things worse. It would look cowardly, defensive. Besides, part of him wanted to see Walter again, not to gloat, not to apologize. He didn't know what for. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the years of pride and entitlement, was a flicker of something unfamiliar. Regret. The courtroom filled long before the event was scheduled to begin. Law students squeezed into seats usually reserved for clerks. Local judges, wearing their robes, sat quietly among the crowd. Even retired attorneys who hadn't set foot in the courthouse for years showed up, their eyes sharp, their arms crossed. At precisely 11 o'clock a.m., the doors opened, and Walter Harris entered. No bailiff announced him, no fanfare played, just the soft creak of leather soles on marble tile and the quiet turning of 100 heads. He walked alone, carrying a small leather folder. His pace was measured, calm. He wore the same navy blue suit from his court appearance, this time with a simple burgundy tie. He nodded politely to those he passed. And then, without hesitation, he stepped to the front of the courtroom, the same place where he'd stood as a defendant just 3 days earlier. He placed his folder on the podium, paused, and began to speak. "Thank you for having me," he said, his voice low, steady, and resonant. "Though I must admit, I've been in this room under slightly different circumstances." Laughter rippled through the crowd, nervous, uncertain. A few glanced at Judge Cole, who sat in the front row now, suit and tie, eyes locked on Walter like a student unsure whether to look away or lean in. "But today," Walter continued, "I'm not here to relive that moment. I'm here to talk about something far more important than personal pride or public perception." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "I'm here to talk about why we sit in these rooms, why we wear robes, why we hold gavels, why we speak last." The courtroom grew still. "In the last few decades," Walter said, "I've seen a shift, not just in the law, but in those who practice it. Judges once saw themselves as stewards of balance. Now, too many see themselves as performers, as kings in black robes, as men and women above correction." A few people shifted uncomfortably. "Humility is not a weakness," he said sharply. "It is the foundation of authority. Without it, the bench becomes a pulpit, the robe becomes a costume, and justice becomes theater. The audience was transfixed. Judge Cole felt something twisting in his chest. Every word landed heavier than the last. He wanted to look away, but couldn't. Walter turned slightly, gazing across the room. We must remember the people who stand before us are not characters in our courtroom drama. They are human beings, flawed, scared, proud, sometimes mistaken, but they deserve dignity. He stopped, eyes meeting Cole's for a heartbeat. Even when they are wrong, especially when they are wrong, they deserve to be heard. A silence fell over the room, one so deep it seemed to echo. I wasn't upset at being fined, Walter added softly. I've paid worse prices for more foolish things, but I was reminded of a truth I had hoped we'd outgrown. That too often, power speaks before it listens. The applause began slowly. One law clerk, then another, then the gallery, then the judges, and finally standing ovations. Even Cole stood, though hesitantly, as if pulled by gravity. Walter simply bowed his head. No system is perfect, he said, as the room quieted again. But if we approach each case with humility and empathy, we come a little closer to what the law was meant to be. And with that, he stepped back from the podium. Afterward, the organizers thanked him profusely. Journalists rushed forward, but he declined interviews. He shook hands, exchanged brief words with students, and politely exited the room. But Judge Cole stayed seated, frozen. As the crowd slowly thinned, he remained alone on the front bench, staring at the empty podium where Walter had stood. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper, awakening. That evening, Judge Cole released a rare public statement. Earlier this week, I failed to uphold the dignity of the courtroom. I disrespected a man who embodies everything the bench should strive to represent. I offer my sincerest apologies to Professor Walter Harris and to the public. The role of a judge is to listen, not to lecture, and I intend to start listening. The statement was shared widely. It didn't erase what had happened, but it was a start. And though Walter never asked for it, the $500 fine quietly disappeared from the court's ledger. But the story wasn't over, because what Walter ignited that day would reach far beyond one courtroom and would soon reshape how a whole state thought about justice. The ripple effects of that courtroom lecture didn't fade. They surged outward like a wave. Within 24 hours, clips from Walter Harris's speech flooded social media. A law student had filmed the entire talk on her phone, uploaded it to YouTube under the title, "He Schooled a Judge in His Own Courtroom, Legend." And within a day, it had over 3 million views. The comment section exploded. This man has more class in one sentence than most officials show in a lifetime. He didn't humiliate the judge. He elevated the courtroom. That's the kind of wisdom the world is starving for. Legal TikTok, law professors on Twitter, even mainstream media ran with the story. CNN aired a feature segment titled Wisdom and Dignity, The Return of Walter Harris. Morning talk shows invited him for interviews, but Walter declined every one. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in change. Back at the courthouse, things shifted. Not overnight, not in some grand, dramatic fashion, but quietly. Judge Cole's demeanor transformed. No more smug remarks, no more theatrical dismissals. He began listening, really listening. He asked questions. He reviewed cases more carefully. For the first time in years, he started arriving early and staying late, reading up on judicial ethics, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, conscience. He started citing Walter Harris's writings in his rulings. One morning, He even left a handwritten note in the staff lounge. "Respect is the beginning of justice. Thanks to those who remind us when we forget." His staff noticed. So did the attorneys. The change didn't go unappreciated. But Walter? He remained distant from the storm he'd caused. 3 weeks later, an unexpected letter arrived at Walter's modest apartment. It was from the State Judicial Review Commission. "In light of recent events, we are establishing a new ethics training series inspired by your lecture. We would be honored if you would advise the program and help us shape the next generation of judges." Walter stared at the letter for a long moment. He could have said no. He had already done his time, taught his students, fought his battles. But something inside stirred. Not pride, not revenge. Hope. He picked up a pen and, in his elegant looping script, wrote 2 simple words: "With honor." The new initiative was launched in early spring. The Harris Principles, Judicial Humility and Ethical Responsibility, became a statewide required training course for all new and sitting judges. Walter helped develop the curriculum himself, though he insisted others take credit publicly. He didn't want a spotlight. He wanted results, and he got them. Reports of judicial misconduct across the state began to drop. Judges started quoting Harris not just for show, but as a genuine guidepost. Legal podcasts began calling it the Walter effect. But perhaps the most surprising moment came at the end of that spring when Judge Cole himself stood behind a podium, this time at a statewide judicial summit. His voice, once smug and performative, was measured, human. "I once made a mistake," he told the room. "I mistook authority for superiority. I thought age meant irrelevance. I thought power meant I didn't have to listen. And then someone reminded me why we swear an oath in the first place." He paused. "That someone is in this room." Every head turned. Walter Harris, seated quietly in the 3rd row, simply nodded. No applause, no standing ovation. Just a long, respectful silence, the kind that said more than clapping ever could. Back home, Walter's life returned to its simple rhythms: morning walks, quiet reading, handwritten letters. But something was different now. People would stop him on the street. Students emailed him from across the country. Retired judges sent handwritten notes thanking him for bringing decency back to the bench. And still, Walter remained humble. One day, he received a small envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, folded once. It was a handwritten note. "You once told me, 'Power without humility is just noise.' I heard the noise. Now I hear the truth. Thank you. BC." Walter smiled, not out of pride, but out of peace. Months later, the original incident was taught in law schools as a case study, not in legal theory, but in professional ethics. "You may never humiliate someone as spectacularly as Judge Cole did," one professor joked. "But if you do, pray you insult a man like Walter Harris, because only someone like him will respond with grace, not vengeance." It became a modern parable, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with protest, but with quiet dignity. One summer evening, Walter sat in the back row of a small town hall where a young public defender was giving her first community lecture on legal rights. She stumbled at the start, fumbled her note cards, spoke too fast. Walter watched without judgment. Afterward, he approached her gently. "You have a powerful voice," he said. "It just needs time to find its pace." She blinked. Are you Walter Harris?" He smiled. "Sometimes." They laughed. She straightened up. "Would you maybe mentor me?" Walter hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. Justice always needs new students." And so the man once mocked, once silenced, once fined in the very court he helped build, became something more than a legend. He became a teacher again, and in doing so reminded an entire generation what justice is truly made of. Not titles, not gavels, but listening, empathy, and the quiet courage to stand tall, especially when the world sits in judgment